Today on the podcast, I have on Hannah Stoddard. Hannah is the director of the Joseph Smith Foundation, which seeks to defend the restoration as given through the prophet Joseph Smith. They do this by battling false narratives and staying true to and telling accurate history and defending Joseph Smith and other early LDS Church Presidents. Hannah and I have an interesting conversation about how the Joseph Smith Foundation was started and the work that they do. Later, we discuss current efforts of so-called historians in revising and rewriting early LDS Church history. In our conversation, Hannah does an amazing job of telling the story of how revisionist history first got started and all the players involved. We also discuss how the tactics used in rewriting LDS history is almost an exact duplicate of how academics rewrote American history concerning our nation's founders. Towards the end of our conversation, Hannah offers fantastic solutions on how faithful Mormons of all types can combat this insidious attempt at rewriting Mormon history. Stick around for that and more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, the listener. When I started this podcast, I wasn't sure if anyone would really listen. Now, to my surprise, this thing has taken on a life of its own. And that's all due to you, the listener, spending your time here with me, and it means a great deal to me. Now, as a husband and father, I'm keenly aware of how important time is. It feels like there's just never enough of it. So when you are spending your time here listening to this podcast, I feel a responsibility to never waste your time. In that spirit, as this podcast has grown, I feel like I need to do you, the listener, justice. I want to continue to produce good content and upgrade the audio quality. That takes better equipment and better software, and that all takes money. Now, I've tried to advertise, but you'd be surprised. There's not a lot of people wanting to advertise on a Mormon Fundamentalist podcast. I know, surprising, right? Now, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do that one of two ways. The first is go over to MormonRenegade.com and hit the donate tab. There you can make a one-time donation, or you can go ahead and set it up to be a monthly recurring donation. Your choice entirely. Now, option number two, because I'm a capitalist, if you want to head on over to MormonRenegade.com, click on the store button, you're going to find that we've got some new swag out. We got some t-shirts, we have a tote, we have cell phone cases, water bottles, coffee cups. We got a bunch of stuff, and more is going to be on the way. So, if you feel like that's something you could do, again, head on over to Mormon Renegade and check all that stuff out. If you're not in that position to do so, I completely understand. We're all squeezed right now with high gas prices and high inflation. So even if you can't, please keep listening and maybe keep the podcast in your prayers so we can continue to grow, produce good content, and better audio quality. Thank you. Today on the podcast, I have here with me Hannah Stoddard, and full disclosure, I am a fanboy of the Stoddards. I think they're rock stars in everything that they do. So, Hannah, thanks for being here.
Oh, I am so glad to be here, and I hope I can live up to that kind of an intro. Thanks so much for the invite.
Well, I wouldn't worry about you. I've always said I'm the weak link here. More of you and less of me is always a good thing.
I don't think so, but this will be a fun conversation.
Absolutely. So, real quick, you were born and raised in the church, right?
I was. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty much a descendant. All my ancestors pretty much pioneer stock in Nauvoo, except for one line that's a convert line. But,
really?
Mm-hmm.
So that goes back quite a way. So you probably have some really cool journals.
Yes. In fact, one of my lines actually goes back to Joseph Smith's cousins. So I guess you can say when we're out there defending Joseph Smith's character, it's also a personal thing.
Yeah, you're kind of sticking up for fam at that point, aren't you?
Sometimes you're like, you know what? The Smiths just are not treasure diggers. I'm sorry. but no, yeah. And some of them bodyguards are involved in those things. So I guess you could say I definitely come from a family that was born and raised with Mormon battalion stories, just talking about being proud of the restoration and that this isn't something to be embarrassed about.
Right. So I'm a convert, right? And I can point back to like one event where I converted to Mormonism. Was there something like that for you, or was it a gradual build up to your conversion?
I would say both. So I grew up, my dad would come home at lunch during his lunch breaks when I was 10, 11, and we would read the Illustrated Church History book series. I don't know how many people have seen those. They're like 26 volumes. They're so good. But we would read those. He would have us listen to Lucy Mack Smith's autobiography of her life and the history of Joseph Smith while we were folding laundry and everything. So we definitely grew up watching all the seminary movies, everything. But I do remember, well, okay, so let me step back just a little bit. So the Joseph Smith Foundation was founded by my father when I was about 10. Just felt impressed to do documentaries and do books, just helping the gospel come alive to people and showing people that there actually is history and science and data to support our faith. And so I grew up doing that, but in the process, I remember a time when I was 14 or 15, I'm trying to remember, and I was going through the Book of Mormon again, and I just sat down and I was like, I really want to know if the Book of Mormon is true. Like, I need to know, because if I'm going to devote my life to this, which is where kind of my mind was going, where I was like, this is more than a family thing, I want to take this on as my own. I was like, I got to know, because I'm not going to live my life devoting to something that's a lie or a waste of time. And I got my answer not in one sitting, but actually in the process of working and studying it out, which is one of the things I think is so important. We have this debate among people where they're like, oh, sometimes people hit hard questions in church history, and people will be like, well, just keep your faith and don't worry about that, and just love your neighbor, and that is very hard. I'm going to speak as a millennial, like, we need to have intellectual conversations. We need to discuss the science. We need to discuss the data. We need to not be afraid of that, because if it's true, the data is going to back it up. And so I think that's the main thing that I've kind of taken on as part of my mission. That's part of my message. And the part of the message of the Joseph Smith Foundation is the real history and the real data does support the restoration, and it does support Joseph Smith.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I just had a gentleman on, I want to say 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he's going to come back on. But he went through and he compiled a book of like all the bullseyes of all the things that Joseph Smith taught that can be found in the Apocrypha.
Oh, cool.
And so it is amazing when he starts getting into it. And we really didn't dive deep, right? We just talked about him and how he got to write in the book and what the inspiration was. But the amount of bullseyes that are in there are just incredible. And so when we talk about having intellectual conversations, I don't think we should shy away from those.
Yes.
I think if we can't defend that on the intellectual plane as well, that's on us, because we're lacking a little bit. Which is one of the things that I absolutely loved about all the work that you guys have done there at the Joseph Smith Foundation, is the fact that while it's definitely faith promoting, it's faith promoting with a brain, right? And I hate, there's nothing wrong with blind faith. But at some point, we have to be able to get down to brass tacks and say, no, this is true because of X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And here's the evidence for that. So
yes.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And look, I'm not a millennial. I have a couple kids who are millennials. And if there's one thing that I've noticed, it's that they just don't have time for BS, right? And so, because they were raised on Google, they were raised on just getting the answer right now, right?
Right.
My generation, we had to go to the library, we had to look things up. You didn't do that because it was fun or it was a quick search. I mean, you really had to go into it. So
typewriter and everything, right?
So I think my generation was conditioned out of laziness. Okay, I'm just going to speak for me. Definitely out of laziness, that this idea of going to the library, well, I got better things to do, like eat Doritos and watch football. But so your generation, though, it's like, we want the answers and we want it now. And you guys have an incredible nose for just BS. And if it comes across that way, a lot of millennials tend to wash their hands with it. So the work you're doing there, I think, is hugely important.
Yeah.
Did your dad ever tell you what his inspiration was for starting this whole thing?
Yeah. So he started when he was around 11 or 12 years old, just studying the gospel like crazy. So he just had an impression one day where he felt impressed that he needed to study the gospel so well that no matter who spoke, he wouldn't be deceived. And so he walks out of his room and he went to his mom, my grandma, and he said, Mom, I'm supposed to learn the gospel so well I won't be deceived. Like, where do I start? And she went over to the shelf, and they had the Journal of Discourses, Teachings of Joseph Smith, and Doctrines of Salvation. She pulls those off, and she's like, well, you can start here. And so he took it in, and he just started just studying and studying, because he just had that thirst. He was like, I want to know how things work. He ended up becoming a software engineer, taught high school and different things. And so he grew up with this desire where he just felt like, oh, there's so many answers to questions people have, right? So he would see people struggling with their teens with pornography or family relationships or questions about church history. And he's like, the answers are out there, but not everyone has the time to go reinvent the wheel and go do all of that research, right? He's doing the studying, like you're saying, before Google and before all of those things. And so so I remember growing up and watching him at the computer, typing away about articles on the Book of Mormon, or, oh, we got to put this together, and we got to do this, and we got to do that. And finally that came together when I was about 10. He lost his job because they closed down the part of his software company and shipped it to India. And so he was like, okay, I'm either going to transition to a new company, and he just felt like, you need to do video and start teaching through video, because that's even more powerful than books, which we've done both, obviously. And so that really became a family mission where he was like, I'm going to do this as a family all together. And that's what we did for our homeschool, actually. Instead of doing endless workbooks and assignments that we're just going to throw away in the trash, my dad was like, well, if you're going to do a research paper, let's go research this out. You want to learn how to go to the archives? Let's go to the university. Let's go to the library and learn how to pull out the documents, learn how to do primary source research. And so that's what we did. And now I've done 7 or 8 documentaries and 5 books, and we're still going strong, even though he just passed away last year. We're carrying it on.
Yeah, when I heard of his passing, my heart went out to you. I know what that feels like. So again, my condolences on that.
Thank you so much.
But,
yeah.
The legacy he left behind, though, not just the work, but seeing his kids pick up the work. Look, as a dad, it's easy. I shouldn't say it's easy. It's easier to do the things that we're passionate about, right?
Absolutely.
It's another thing to bring your kids along to do it.
That requires patience of Job. I'm just going to say
that and it requires, and I'm not the best at this whatsoever, but it requires you being able to pass that along in a meaningful way. And so the fact he was able to do that with his kids is just awesome, and I think speaks to his character.
Well, it's honestly what converted us. I can honestly say if I hadn't grown up being engaged in actually doing it hands-on, if I had just only been studying, I don't think I would actually be here today. I would probably be pretty wild.
Really?
I'm going to be honest. But it was actually being engaged, seeing people's hearts changed, and seeing this matters, and we need to make a difference. And we can't sit around because, when we were growing up, we would always watch this movie about Mother Teresa. There's 2 motion pictures on her life. And my dad would pause it all the time, all the way through, and he'd be like, okay, you can see her giving her life to help people. And there's physical people dying physically right now, starving in third world countries and everything. That's important. He's like, but there's millions of people starving spiritually. And we've got to fix both, and that's part of what drives, I think, my passion and my siblings' passion to keep this going, is because the Restoration does have answers and to solve every problem. We're out there trying to solve all of our societal issues and all of our political issues with this or that campaign, this or that program, this or that latest trend. It doesn't work. It does not work, but the gospel will work. And that's why it's important.
Absolutely. And I think we're at a stage now, in speaking of society, where we can see what's happened when you cut those underpinnings out.
Absolutely.
Right? Now, while the vast majority of the country and American society wasn't Mormon of any stripe, there were some very common elements there, right?
Yes.
And those underpinnings have been jerked out from under society, and now we're in free fall.
Right.
And one of the things I've noticed in speaking about society, and full disclosure, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, I'm a huge nerd when it comes to the revolutionary period of America. That stems from, of all things, a football game. Me and a buddy, I'm a huge Green Bay fan, and he was a huge Philadelphia Eagles fan. And we found out they were playing on a Monday night in Philadelphia. And we thought, okay, we're gonna book some tickets and we're just gonna go. And so we did. And so we went, and we were like, let's go a couple days early because I want to look at all the sites. I want to go see the Liberty Bell and all these other things.
How old were you at this time?
I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
This was probably about 2003 or 4, just a few years after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And so my wife, who's just an absolute rock star, she's like, yeah, go have fun. She's like, see you later. So me and my buddy, we jump on this flight and we go. And what I wasn't prepared for was what happened when I walked into Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It didn't feel like it was holy ground, right? When I walked in, I still get goosebumps thinking about it today.
Yeah.
The spirit was just as strong there as it was in Martin's Cove or in Nauvoo or on Temple Square or anything like that. The spirit just said something important happened right here. And this started me down the road of doing real research into the founders, the Constitutional Convention, the original arguments, all those things. And I walked away from there, from that experience. I mean, it influenced me so much, I ended up moving the family out there for about 3 years, just so I could be closer to it. Mm-hmm. So when I'm done with my research, I realize we're way, way, way off course. I don't know what happened, but holy cow. So I started diving into what happened. And what I noticed is that there's this revisionist history that has happened.
Right.
Where it was a very progressive idea, and the idea is that if we can if we can degrade the founders and dismiss them, well, then we can dismiss the founding documents, and then we can remake this government into something that's closer to our desires. And so in order to do that, they had to change the narrative, right?
Right.
No longer were the founders men of integrity who pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. Now they're rich white slave owners.
Right.
And in that process, you can now degrade what it is they did, and you can now move the country where you want to go. That's done. That's happened. It's over. Unless it's getting caught at home, it's over. My concern, and we talked about this on our phone call, is that the same tactic, the very same tactic, is now being employed inside Mormonism. Right. And I don't care if it's the LDS Church, I don't care if it's an organized group of Mormon fundamentalists, or if it's an independent, if you're an independent.
Whether it's the Community of Christ, even, everywhere we are seeing this.
Right, and we're losing our kids in droves.
Yes, we are.
And we're not just kids, but we're losing adult members in droves.
Right.
And so that's what I wanted to have you on, is to talk about this rewrite of Mormon history, this revisionist history, and how we got here. Who were the players involved?
Right. What you're describing is so important because our identity is shaped by our history, right? To understand where you come from, what you've experienced, even what your ancestors have experienced, that really shapes a lot of identity. So if you even look at the Book of Mormon, we believe is the most correct book, right? It's a history. That's what it is.
Right.
So history teaches us how God acts, how God works, who God is. His character is all defined through history, and our identity and how we work with that. So what you're describing is exactly right. And it's actually even before the founding fathers. So if you go back to the very founding colonists, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, right? If you go back 150, 200 years and read the textbooks on them, they were amazing. They were the heroes. Even read First Nephi, right? Nephi's like, these are choice saints of God. They're humble followers. He paints them like they're heroes, right? Well, how did we get to today where no one even knows anything about them? You go, and this is what we the very first documentary did, technically it's the second, but the first one that's really out there still, 4-Day Covenant on the Land, we went to BYU, and we went to the sidewalk, and we interviewed students, and we asked them, what do you know about the first Thanksgiving? What do you know about the Pilgrims? What do you know about the Puritans? What's the difference between the two? our best youth don't know the answers to those basic questions, and it's a strategy. This is every communist regime, every socialist regime, they go into a country and that's what they do. What did Mao do when he went into China? They destroy the museums, they destroy the history books, because it wipes out people's identity, so now they can be given a new identity, usually for the worst. Right. So, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you should bring up the Pilgrims and the Puritans. One of my favorite speeches to read is by John Winthrop. When he's coming across and he puts his people under covenant.
Yes.
Where he talks about we need to embrace each other in familiar commerce, making each other's plights our own, working together and mourning together. And if you take that speech, which was not available to Joseph Smith at that time,
right,
and then you go read what Alma says at the waters of baptism, right? It is the same covenant.
It's the same language. They talk the same.
And the founders understood this. Our first national seal was supposed to be Moses and the children of Israel following the pillar of fire.
Right.
Everybody who came over here understood that this is a continuation of the Israel story, right? Of God's chosen people.
Right. And how did that happen? So I want to just mention this just because you're bringing it up here, and I think it's so fascinating. So the strategy is always you first denigrate, and then that leads to undermine, right? So people are like, why would I listen to a bumbling buffoon, right? So denigrate George Washington, denigrate the founders. We're going to go into this, denigrate Joseph Smith, and it's like, well, why would I care what he says? So then that leads to ignoring, which then leads to where they're completely forgotten. And we've seen that. We pretty much completed that cycle when it comes to the founding fathers, meaning the colonists, and then we're almost completed on the founding fathers, in political founding fathers, and we're heading that direction with the founding fathers of the Restoration. And so I just want to use an example just on the Pilgrims and Puritans, and then we can probably move into the Restoration. But how did that happen? How did we get to the point? Most people don't know the history. Well, a big key player was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, anyone that's gone to high school is probably like, oh, well, The Scarlet Letter, I love that book, or it's one of the classics, right? So I grew up in different homeschool communities, and they're like, well, if you're educated, like, you read The Scarlet Letter, and that's such a good book. So I actually taught it in a literature high school class. Okay, not only is the book bogus history, but if you actually go into who wrote The Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and his history, he literally wrote it with an agenda to destroy any respect for the Puritan forefathers. He himself was a descendant of Puritans, and he wanted to distance himself. He changed the spelling of his name so that he could just cut that connection with them. And he had involvement and connection to the occult. He mocked Christian living. His family had, his wife and daughter had connections with mediums. And so he goes in, he writes the Scarlet Letter, he writes these other books, The House of Seven Gables, all these books, because he wanted to reshape the way we think. And the adversary was smart. He took us out because he changed the history. And now today, no one even knows who they are, which is a tragedy, because they're the ones that founded one of the greatest civilizations that did succeed, that Nephi said was blessed because they were righteous. And now we're falling apart. So when everyone's like, what do we do with the country? Let's try this policy. Let's try this politics. It's, guys, we've entirely eroded our foundation. And until we go back to the foundation, we can't move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So often we tend to look forward for solutions.
Right.
But there's times when we need to stop and look back and say, there was our starting point. Why are we way over here?
Right.
Yeah, I'm a land surveyor by profession. So, 0.05 of a foot isn't very much inside of a foot. But if you carry that out a mile, all of a sudden you have a big gap from your original course heading.
Right.
And that's where we're at. We don't have our true north anymore. We don't know where we're at, and we're way off course.
Yes.
And the only way for us now to get back on course, I feel, is to go back and to look at the starting point and then course correct from there.
And interestingly, this is the same pattern that the Nephites took in the Book of Mormon. So a lot of times I don't hear people pull out this verse, but in Helaman, it's in Helaman 5, you have Nephi. I believe it's the son of Helaman, I want to say. I could be wrong. Could be Nephi, the son of Nephi. But there at the end of the Book of Mormon, and he gives this big lament. And he says, oh, that I would lived in the days of my forefathers. I wish I lived in the days of Nephi and Lehi when people were righteous, when people were good. He's like, I just want to go back there. Why did Mormon put that in?
Because he knew we'd face that same sentiment now.
Because he's saying, if you're wise, you will say, oh, that I lived in the days of the Pilgrims, when the people actually cared about the scriptures. Oh, that I lived in the days of the Founding Fathers, when they respected and feared God. Oh, that I lived in the days of Joseph Smith, when we built a foundation that was solid. Right. And that is the foundation. It's the only way to solve these problems. But the problem is you can't even have that conversation with people to sit down and be like, okay, well, let's study what Joseph Smith said and live it, because they're like, well, why would I listen to Joseph Smith? He was a treasure digger. He was involved in magic. He was basically a product of his time who was an idiot. He didn't know what he was talking about. And that's coming from revisionist history. So the same revisionist history tactic that we've seen with the founding of America, that we've seen with the Founding Fathers, we have going on right now in the church.
Excuse me. Real quick, let's start here with talking about revisionist history within the church. Where do we start to see it? At what point does it happen? Does it happen right after Brigham Young settles in Utah? Does it happen, in the early 20th century? Where does it start?
Okay, well, you could say all the way back in Joseph Smith's day. This is always the adversary's tactic. So we let me start here. So lay some groundwork. So we wrote this book called Seer Stone v. Urim and Thummim, Book of Mormon Translation on Trial. And in that book, we go into all of the accounts that people claim support the idea that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon using a seer stone and a hat. It's not historically viable. I'll have this debate with anyone. There are no credible sources that support the idea that Joseph Smith used a seer stone. He used the Urim and Thummim, which is not one dark stone. It's two transparent stones in the rim of a bow, the whole description given by Joseph Smith. But we go through all of them. Sometimes people are like, but the witnesses. And so, okay, let's go into those. Let's go into David Whitmer. Let's go into Martin Harris. When we went into the history with David Whitmer and Martin Harris and Emma, it's fascinating that shortly after Joseph Smith died, there was literally a movement where there were people who apostatized and who hated Joseph Smith, who believed they were getting revelations from God, quote unquote, right? Their God, telling them to rewrite the history, to write a new history, to reveal the man of sin. Joseph Smith was this man of sin. And part of that was the seer stone narrative. Anyways, that's a whole nother conversation. I mean, we could sit here and have a whole hour conversation, but it's been an agenda throughout history where we just change the history. That's frankly what David Whitmer did. When everyone quotes the most famous quote that they go to for David Whitmer saying, oh, he said, he gave this description of the translation of the Book of Mormon and it supports the seer stone hypothesis, then people don't look at the footnote. The footnote is an anti-Mormon publication called An Address to All the Believers in Christ. And if you go read the whole thing, it is literally a revisionist history from David Whitmer's perspective that's designed, same strategy. First denigrate Joseph Smith, that leads to undermining him, and then ignoring, moving on to a new church.
Absolutely. So we see it at the very beginnings, right? You would think that in Brigham picking up, right, moving the saints out west, outside of the United States. Let's not forget that. I think everyone forgets that
in Deseret.
that he's leaving the country. He's like, we're done. We're out of here. You would have thought in this Great Basin kingdom, so to speak, that they would have been safe here from that. But that's not the case. At what point during the tenure of Brigham Young or after do we start seeing the revisionist history creep in again?
Well, I'm going to say it's almost immediately. I mean, if you go read Revealed Educational Principles, almost immediately you had individuals who were frankly very antagonistic to the church coming, and they use the education system, which is brilliant, right? So they come out here, and what do? They set up newspapers and they set up schools, free schools. You don't need to pay for your own schools. You know, parents like, why work so hard? We'll set you up a free school. Just bring your kids in here and we'll train you. And many of them had agendas. But so that's a whole nother conversation. But it's really always been this strategy, but I think we really see it picking up from my perspective. Beginning in the 1900s, the same time that we see a culture shift in America really picking up. So the same time you start seeing a departure from Christian moorings in policies, in economics, in even the Industrial Revolution, moving people away from an agricultural, agrarian lifestyle. You see the introduction of rock music. You even see changes in dating and culture patterns and standards. At that same time, you have... Well, okay, so step back just a little bit. So Joseph Smith said that when God sets up his kingdom, the devil sets up his, right? So there always is a parallel. There's always a counterfeit, and they just grow up side by side, wheat and tares, right? right there. And so it's fascinating if you go study, okay, when Joseph Smith is alive, 1830 is when Charles Lyell publishes his Principles of Geology, which is really the forerunner to laying down a lot of the principles that would contribute to Darwinian evolution. And then you've got Charles Darwin publishing in the Origin of Species in the mid 1800s. You've got Karl Marx publishing his books. They all are developing their ideologies the same time Joseph Smith comes about. So Joseph Smith says, well, this is the kingdom of God. They're like, oh, this is a different kingdom, right? President Benson is the one who pointed out the 5 antichrists that people quote a lot, which is, I mean, that sounds strong to say they're antichrists, but really they are. Their philosophies, you go Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, John Maynard Keynes, Karl Marx, and John Dewey, the father of public education. So what happens is you have all of these universities around the country of the United States that are embracing these ideas. They're embracing these progressive ideologies. And you have the Latter-day Saints, and they're struggling out here, and they just want their kids to be school educated, right? They want their kids to have the chances and the success and the knowledge, which isn't in itself bad, right? We believe in being a cultured people. We believe in being educated. We believe in not just blind faith. We believe in we want to build something better. But a lot of parents were like, well, we can't do that ourselves. You know, the early presidents of the church were like, do your own schools. Do not send your children to a school without the Bible, and not just the Bible, but the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. John Taylor was so strong. He was like, we will never have a day without the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, right?
You know, I just read something out of the Journal of Discourses where, and I can't remember if it was Taylor or Young, but he had said, why do we want to import Babylonian schools into the midst of Zion?
Right.
Why would we want to do that? And he was pushing hard to not let this happen.
Right.
They understood, right? Yes. In their day, being inspired, they understood what would come.
Well, actually, this is the fascinating thing. This is the foundations of BYU, which ironically today is probably one of the most prominent proponents of Darwinian evolution. Well, when it was founded, Brigham Young, and we have this quote on our website, he says, I'm endowing this school to do what? To fight Darwinism and Marxism. So that's the foundation, right? So the foundation is this restoration vision of we're going to build schools to train the youth of Zion to be able to articulately and educate, you know, with skill and poise, be able to refute false doctrine and false ideologies, but it's hard. And I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, why the academies failed, why that didn't succeed, but it didn't. And people started sending off their kids to Harvard and to Yale, which by then had departed. I mean, those universities themselves were founded by Puritans.
They were colleges where you were supposed to go to become either a lawyer, doctor, or a minister.
Right.
That was the 3, right?
And so, but they had moved away from their Christian moorings, and now they're embracing progressive ideology. So basically, these Latter-day Saint parents are sending their kids off to school, and that's where we really see the development of New Mormon history. So that's the kind of the term that's used, and we talk about this in the Faith Crisis books. How do we get to the point from a Joseph Smith that's this hero to rough stone rolling today? So for those that don't know, rough stone rolling is considered one of the top biographies on Joseph Smith, and it's written by a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but it is one of the number one things causing people to lose their faith in Joseph Smith and in the gospel. And it's through the history, and a lot of people are like, well, we need to accept the facts. Like, we want to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. The problem is it's not real history.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, one of the books that is touted most frequently by John Dehlin is Rough Stone Rolling.
Yep.
Right? And there was actually a video here not too long ago of Richard Bushman himself saying we have to retell our history.
Yes.
He came right out and just said it, right? Which now you enter into a spookier phase, because now the masks are kind of coming off, right?
Right.
They're not pretending anymore. Now it's, no, we need to change our history.
Oh, they're very proud of it. It's very, but a lot of people don't know how we got here. And that is what we set out to figure out. So we had, with the Joseph Smith Foundation, we had been countering rough stone rolling. We'd been going into the history and being like, okay, guys, this is why the Seer Stone narrative isn't true. This is why Joseph Smith was not a treasure digger. This is why the whole magical worldview, this idea that Joseph Smith and his family were involved in the occult and rituals and folk magic, it's just bogus. So we were going into that, but we were like, well, how did this happen? How did we get here? Right? And it all went back in our research to a man named Leonard Arrington. And that is, that's the main theme of the Faith Crisis books. And so it's 2 volumes. The first one is Faith Crisis, We Were Not Betrayed, because that is the big issue. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's why people are struggling. It's not even so much about, oh, this church history issue or this. Like, people debate, is it polygamy? Is it the Book of Abraham? It's actually not really any of those things. It's what they call a trust gap, where people are saying, okay, I grew up with one narrative, and now I'm being told, oh, actually, that's whitewashed nonsense. It's not even true. Here's the real uncomfortable truth. And people are feeling betrayed. And they're feeling like, why didn't I ever hear this in Sunday school? Why wasn't I ever told this? And so we were going into this. Okay, what happened? So just to kind of like just give some highlights of that story, because obviously that's a huge story. But Leonard Arrington, he was one of these kids who grew up in a Latter-day Saint family, and he goes off to college, and in college he has a faith crisis, and he gets introduced to Darwinian evolution and everything, actually by the Institute faculty and people who were members of the church, but were kind of under this guise of they wanted to change the direction of the church, and so they sit down and they're like, well, we can talk about this, like we can, let's reconcile, science and your faith, and so Leonard Arrington, basically, he goes through a faith crisis. The first year after college, he writes, or after his first year of college, he writes a paper called, I believe it was called The Two Arringtons, and he talks about, I'm a different person, and I don't believe what I grew up with. Which really it started before a little bit. He had only read the Bible. He read the Bible in the Book of Mormon once when he was 13, and he never read it through again the rest of his life, which is pretty shocking when you consider that he actually ended up becoming the church historian. And that's the story that we go into. But he was the church historian for a number of years, writing our history, and not really any interest in the scriptures or the doctrine or the traditional foundations. His dad offered to pay for his mission during the Great Depression. Said, go on a mission. Wow. And which was a huge sacrifice for the family. And he said, no. He said, I'm going to college. So already he's coming from a different worldview, right, than someone maybe like a Joseph Fielding Smith, who he gets married and then he goes on a mission, which was customary in those days. Yep. But he leaves his bride behind. He goes on a mission, doesn't convert a single person in England. He's jeered and mocked the whole time, but he's like, I'm here because the Lord wants me to. He comes home. He turns down a very lucrative job because it would put him in the company of people he didn't want to really associate with, and he basically devotes the rest of his life to trying to share the gospel. So he was the kid that would sneak off at 8 years old from a ball game to go read the Book of Mormon in the hayloft, so just a very different kind of perspective. So coming back to Leonard Arrington. So Leonard Arrington, he's already kind of adopting these progressive ideas, again, coming from the universities, and he starts falling into different camps of friends. There was one group in particular that called themselves the Swearing Elders in Salt Lake City. We have some funny stories from that group in our book, but they hailed from BYU faculty, University of Utah faculty, just these different people that really would get together. They were open about it, just to criticize scripture, criticize church authorities, just criticize. They wanted change. They wanted to move the church in a new direction, right? And so they'd talk about, how do we do this? Well, Leonard Arrington had gone really into economics, but he had what he believed was a revelation from God, that he felt he was told by God to write history and to write the history of the church. So he felt like he was on a mission from God, like God wanted him to do this and to change the whole direction. But he was he was smart. He said he was different than some other progressives that like to create waves and controversy. And he was like, we do it subtly, we do it strategically. And he was brilliant at that. He was definitely a charismatic, a personable person, which isn't bad, and in his mind, he really believed he was doing good, right? In his mind, he's like, I've got to save the church from these primitive, old-fashioned ideas. We got to move it to a brave new world, right? Obviously, so he's going to adopt more of a progressive viewpoint. For a traditionalist, they're going to say, no, that's and what do I mean by traditionalist? A traditionalist is someone who says, okay, Joseph Smith, the foundation Joseph Smith laid is solid, it is true, we can trust it, we stick with it, and if we build on that foundation, we'll be safe. A progressive perspective instead says, well, you know what? Joseph Smith had a few good ideas. He's a nice guy. But he was a product of this time. He had a lot of mostly weird ideas. Who knows if the scriptures are really true at all? We just need to say, okay, that was nice, Joseph. You had a few nice ideas, but let's move to something better, right? Let's do something better. And we are so sophisticated now that we can achieve that.
It's amazing because it is exactly the same way when you talk about. And I know I keep coming back to this, but I think it's important because if we can identify what was done to the country, we can now look and we can see exactly where we are as a people down that same road.
Right.
So I point back to that a lot, not because I'm trying to put undue emphasis there, but because it provides the roadmap.
Absolutely.
And it is a frightening parallel that we need to heed very closely because we're replaying it all over again.
Yes. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but there is so much work to do in actually writing what I would say is real history, true history, traditionalist history. So much that has not been done that needs to be done. Like our children need, I'll just give one example as a side tangent, then we can head back. But the history of women in the church has never been written. Until we wrote Joseph Smith's Plural Wives Volume 1, published it this year on Helen Mar Kimball. That's really the first biography in the last 100 years on any of the women of our foundations actually telling their stories, actually getting into their story, which blows my mind. I don't know how do we get this far without works on Mary Elizabeth Rollins-Leitner and Eliza R. Snow and Mary Fielding Smith. We are losing so much of our history. And Leonard Arrington was brilliant because he went in and he found other. He gathered together a whole team of professors and writers, and he mentored students. He was smart. He's like, if we're gonna change the direction of the church, if we're gonna change the history, we need to raise a new generation. It's gonna take several generations to do this. So he would go and find kids and students that had talent and potential, and he'd invest in them. And frankly, that's now how we have 2 generations later. Most historians writing on Latter-day Saint history are progressive. They've done a brilliant job. My hat's off to them. They have succeeded. But the problem with that is faith isn't getting stronger, it's tanking. We're having the worst faith crisis we've ever seen in the history of the church. I don't think there's anything that can compare to it.
No. And then you couple that with some things that I've done podcasts on that have really concerned me, because I pay attention to Mormon Twitter a lot, right? Don't post a lot because you're not going to win any arguments on it. Let me rephrase that. You're not going to make an impact, right? You're going to make some people angry, and you're going to maybe make a point. But other than that, you're not changing hearts and minds, right? But the one thing I noticed was that there was this strange conflation coming out of BYU of the United Order was nothing more than communism with a religious bent. So I had on guys who understood United Order and how it differed and did an A-B comparison, because it is. And you're right. They were very good about finding the kids that they could do that with. Right. And then actually putting those kids in a position of semi-authority to kind of recruit. And as you look at it, it's just insidious.
Right. Yes. And a lot of people didn't know the story, but Leonard Arrington kept detailed journals documenting really this narrative, how this came about. And when he passed away, he told his kids, he said he didn't want anyone to read them for 25 years. His kids talked him down to 10 years because they're like, by then, we can let the cat out of the bag, essentially, because he said there were names and information he didn't want public. And you say, oh, a few journals, right? I don't know, people listening, how many journals they have, but a couple, whatever. Okay. This journal was 50 boxes, 40,000 pages. So his journal is 40,000 pages, 26 linear feet of shelving. So that's a massive journal.
Has anyone gotten a hold of them yet?
So they did get released. And we had a team go through the majority that's relevant for this conversation. We went through all of the entries it took. So a number of them were published. I'm trying to remember what year it starts, but it goes till that day when he dies. I think 1982, I want to say, but and I could be wrong on that. But we had a team actually go through all of his journals and read all of these entries to pull out the meat, kind of pull out the story. And that's what we wrote about in the Faith Crisis 1 and 2 books, is to tell the story. How did we get to this point where we have a new history? Because the problem is kids are coming to their parents, or now it's people of all ages, right? It's not just the kids. And they're sitting down and they're saying, you know what? We were lied to about our history, and I've been reading A Rough Stone Rolling, or I've been reading Mormon Enigma, or I've been reading such and such book, or I've been going to my history class, whether it's at BYU or University of Utah Valley University. And you know what? Joseph Smith was not a good guy, and I don't have confidence in him at all. I do not have zero confidence in Brigham Young. There's all these problems. They were this, they were that. And parents are just sitting there like, whoa, I don't even know how to begin to answer these questions. I don't even know where to begin to look. And so that's why we wrote the Faith Crisis books, because we said, okay, you need to understand what's really going on. This is not about, new history is coming to light, right? That's the big story. Well, now, with the internet and all of this, there's so much new history. Okay, so obviously we are making new discoveries, but there's been no discoveries that really substantially change the substance of what we're discussing here. Were the foundations of the Restoration righteous, or were they corrupt? Was Joseph Smith a man of integrity or not? We haven't really found any earth-shattering discoveries that changes the substance of the argument. So yes, we can add more to the story, we can understand more. That's all fine and good, but really what we're talking about, the reason why people are struggling is because the narrative is changing. And it's changing to a progressive narrative. And so people need to understand, why is it changing and why does it matter? Because think about it this way. I remember one time talking to a woman that went progressive, and I remember overhearing, I overheard her talking, and I knew her, so I kind of joined the circle. I was like, wait, what are you saying? But she was talking about the Book of Mormon, how it was biased history. because she said, well, it's written from Nephi's perspective. If we had Laman and Lemuel's version of the story, it'd be completely different, right? So she's like, well, Nephi's writing a biased history, instead of understanding, no, that history is written through inspiration from God. That history is, there is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as, okay, and how do we get to that truth? And that's where traditionalists and progressives start to differ. So a lot of times progressives want to tell traditionalists, well, you guys are just into hiding history, right? You just want a really nice story of rainbows and unicorns, and you don't want to like really face the music, right? That's not what this conversation is about. This is not about hiding dark parts in history. It's not about hiding Mountain Rose Massacre. It's not about hiding things about Brigham Young. Let's talk about it. Let's put everything on the table. Let's be open. Let's get into the nitty-gritty details. That's not what the debate is about. The debate is about how do we interpret that history. And it's important because it's challenging people's worldviews.
Absolutely. And whenever you jerk out from underneath a society, whether that is, the country, whether that is Mormons, Catholics, I don't care. When you jerk out the underpinnings of this is our bedrock, you have set that society into freefall. And it will be stopped. The question is who's going to stop it?
Right.
Right? Are the more traditionalists going to come in and defend it? Is it going to fall into the open arms of less than genuine men who desire a different church than what has historically been around, or does it just shatter entirely? And those are the questions that I think we all have to ask ourselves. And which side do we fall on
right
that?
Right.
And why do we fall on those sides? And that's why I think the books are so important, because it maps it out. In those books that you wrote, what was the most startling thing that you found?
Oh, that is a good question. I think probably is just seeing that there was a plan, and there was a deliberate effort to move us in a different direction. And I say that understanding, and I want people to realize this, for the most part, most of these progressive men were and are 100% sincere. Like in their, like that's what you got to understand, right? Leonard Arrington is sitting here and he's like, I just don't see much value in the scriptures. That's his perspective, right? So in his mind, he's like, well, who would I value more, Darwin or Moses? Darwin. Darwin's, he even compares Joseph Smith receiving revelations to Darwin coming up with the origin of species, like they're comparable, and so in his mind, you have to understand when Leonard Arrington is sitting down across from Ezra Taft Benson, he's like, Ezra Taft Benson just doesn't understand reality. And of course, Ezra Taft Benson is looking at Leonard Arrington and he's like, this guy doesn't understand reality, right? But so they're coming from two different worldviews. And I think that's critical because otherwise we talk past each other in conversations if we don't understand what's the worldview that's shaping how we approach things. So I think probably the most shocking or surprising thing that I learned was that this was not just a debate in universities or even behind closed doors, but it actually took place in church headquarters in the mid to late 1900s. That this was something that was being discussed, that was being battled over, with everything from people using pen names to smuggling and sneaking documents back and forth. Like it's a very fascinating story. It's two sides that are both determined to save the church from their perspective, right? And so just to lay some groundwork for what I mean by that. So I mentioned Leonard Arrington was called to be a church historian. Interestingly enough, he was called to be the church historian under Joseph Fielding Smith's administration. Now, which is a little bit ironic if you actually know the difference between Joseph Fielding Smith and Leonard Arrington. They're diametrically opposed. And you have to understand Leonard Arrington wasn't completely upfront about his beliefs, who he was, and where he was coming from. So he sets up his history division. He sets up his team, and he's thinking, how do we do this in a calculated way?
I'm sorry, hold on one second. You said there's a couple things I want to say here. First off, and I agree with you 100%. The folks who are rewriting Mormon history, Leonard Arrington, he's doing it out of a good place, out of a place of sincerity. However, I would make the argument that the folks who attacked us on 9/11, they were totally sincere about their religion, right? Being sincere doesn't make you right. Right? Yes. And that's what I think we have to understand is that, you know, just because someone approaches it with vigor doesn't make their position correct.
Absolutely.
The other thing I want to dive into real quick is you just said Arrington wasn't completely honest or forthright in setting up his department. Can you dive into that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Yes. So you had Arrington's coming from a perspective where he's like, we've got to change the history. And he was well aware that there were members of the Quorum of the 12 and others who, if they heard that, would be like, no, we're not doing that. Let's use Ezra Taft Benson for one.
Boyd K. Packer.
Right, exactly. And so he starts for years just kind of subtly like, okay, well, let's do this project and this project and this project. And really, I would say flew under the radar for a number of years until there was a book published by two members of his division. It was called The Story of the Latter-day Saints. And we go into that story. And it gets published. It's fully published. And it has the church's name on it. And members of the Quorum of 12, some of them get a copy. And they're thinking, what in the world? Like, this just came out from our press, because it had new perspectives on Joseph Smith. It talked about Joseph Smith and a little bit of the treasure digging stuff. I mean, not as extreme as maybe what's being talked about today, but it's starting to lay that foundation of changing how we see Joseph Smith. It somewhat discredited the story of the Seagulls. It kind of undermines some of the more providential aspects of our history. So that comes out, and it makes its way to President Ezra Taft Benson. And that's, if anyone knows anything about President Ezra Taft Benson, he was someone that stood, right?
Benson's my boy. Yes. I'm just going to say I'd ride or die with that old man. So,
and a lot of people know his stance on political things, but they don't realize that I honestly do not believe we would have a church left today. Meaning, like, we would have had the faith crisis we're having now, decades before, if it was not for President Ezra Taft Benson.
It's very interesting to look at that time period in history. I've often looked at history, and it's really hard to deny God, because at certain times, certain men and certain people will come up at certain points to defend freedom, will defend religion to no end. And I find it interesting that, if I'm not mistaken, Benson is president of the LDS Church for a time about the same time Ronald Reagan is president, and he's fighting the communists. You know, you have Thatcher, and then
you had Margaret Thatcher, and then you had Pope John Paul II, and you had Ronald Reagan and Ezra Benson.
And then Benson's right there, and he's doing his own thing. And so, and I get goosebumps thinking about it, because you can see the hand of the Almighty as men and women once again, you know, cast their well-being on the providence of divine protection.
Yes. And people know, and the fascinating thing is, you know, you keep coming back to this thing of, okay, it's the same thing that happened with the founding fathers. So President Benson was the one that first made that connection, really. So his talk, God's Hand in Our Nation's History, given at BYU, devotional address. So he does this. He starts out and he says, okay, this is how the founding fathers are being denigrated, and the revisionist history is trying to take them out. And then he transitions and goes to church history. And he starts talking about, well, there's people that say this idea, and people that say this idea, and people that say this idea. Now, the fascinating thing is, President Benson gives that address, and little did he know that his own church historian, probably a few office doors down, believed a lot of those same things. But President Benson didn't know, but he was very soon to know. It was actually just a few months later when this whole controversy over the story of the Latter-day Saints broke out. And they started having meetings, and so they're meeting and sitting down with Ezra Taft Benson and Marky Peterson and Leonard Arrington and Spencer W. Kimball. And so Leonard Arrington writes about these meetings in his diary, and that's really how we know about them today. And it's fascinating to see the dialogue that goes back and forth, because one of the things that comes out is, I forget which general authority it was, but Leonard Arrington talks to one of them and they say, well, what's really the difference between you and a Joseph Fielding Smith? And the fascinating thing is, so progressives will always tell you today, well, that Joseph Fielding Smith, they were covering up history and they were whitewashing things and we lied about this and we lied about that. So Leonard Arrington is asked this question, like, well, what's the difference between you and Joseph Fielding Smith? And you know what he says? He says, actually, our history is pretty much the same. Other than, as we're getting into the archives, as we're updating things and finding documents, we're going to correct some historical details. Absolutely. We're going to learn a little bit more. When Joseph Fielding Smith wrote about the Mountain Meadows Massacre in the early 1900s, we've learned more since then, just by finding more documents and research.
Right.
Great. But he said, other than that, the narrative is pretty much the same, but how I see God's hand in history is different than how Joseph Fielding Smith sees God's hand in history. He says Joseph Fielding Smith sees God as like involved, and blessings and providence comes from God, and opposition comes from the adversary. He's like, I don't see it that way. More of a secular. God steps out of the picture. A deist. Right. And we have more of this attitude of, well, let's look at the economics and let's look at this, and we can explain this naturally. We don't need the spiritual aspect. And that's when President Benson goes to BYU and he gives us God's hand in our nation's history. He says, we need history the way the Book of Mormon tells it, with God's hand in it. You can't have a good history without that spiritual element. And this is where you start having the debate. And so people, you move on to Boyd K. Packer. Boyd K. Packer comes hugely under attack with his talk, The Mantle is Greater Than the Intellect. And some people have misinterpreted what he said as saying, well, we just want to kind of whitewash things. Well, if you actually go into Leonard Arrington's own diary, he's having conversations with Boyd K. Packer. And Boyd K. Packer's like, I don't have a problem with us discussing tough issues. Okay, let's talk about polygamy. Let's talk about Brigham Young using tobacco. Let's talk about some of these things, but it's how we talk about it. It's our understanding. It's how we interpret it. And that's where the debate comes down to. And that's where traditionalists like President Benson and Boyd K. Packer and even Gordon B. Hinckley, people are kind of surprised. It was actually Gordon B. Hinckley that shut down Leonard Arrington's rewriting of Joseph Smith, which was actually the forerunner to Rough Stone Rolling, which is, I guess we'll go there really quick. So they're battling for years. Leonard Arrington, kind of the mask comes down, and so he's battling with just different church leaders for years. And he has this dream of writing the Sesquicentennial History Project. And Volume 1 is going to be written by this man named Richard Bushman. No one had heard of him then. Everyone's pretty much heard of him now. The author of Rough Stone Rolling. It was Leonard Arrington that really got Richard Bushman into the area of writing church history and really kind of inspired this, which is all documented. Again, it's all in our Faith Crisis books. But he writes this first volume of this history on Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism is what it was later published. He writes this manuscript. It goes to the Quorum of the 12, and it gets vetoed. But the church was in a quandary because they had made a legal agreement to publish it. So now they're a little bit caught, and so it's actually kind of a funny story how they maneuver out of that, where basically Gordon B. Hinckley, it's Elder Hinckley at the time, he goes to the lawyers and he's like, we need a way to get out of this contract. And they're like, you can't, you're going to get sued if we don't publish this. And he's like, I didn't ask if there's a way, I said find a way.
Right.
And so they did this thing of delaying, and so it was eventually just never published, and finally the authors gave up, and Richard Bushman took his manuscript and published it elsewhere. And finally it got so heated that they actually they shut the entire history division down. They took away the title of church historian from Leonard Arrington, and they moved him and a number of his staff to BYU. Now, the thing about moving them to BYU, though, was from a strategy, and Arrington talks about this in his book, where he's like, this is so depressing, like my dream. And the progressives call it the Camelot era, when they were up there running the history division. But he's like, but you know what? If we go to BYU, I can spend my time. Maybe it's not quite as glorious. It doesn't feel like a victory, but in the long run, we might have lost the battle, but we're going to win the war. Let's go after the kids.
Exactly. Because they play a game that's different than the game we play, right? The one thing I'll say for traditionalists, conservative, fundamentalists, whatever it is that we tend to be kind of reactionary, right? We tend to react.
We're not very good, actually, at fighting this war.
Right. We're not good at planning. The progressives, in whatever stripe you want to pan, they don't mind playing the long game, right? I mean, there was a group of progressives that were called the Fabian Socialists, who took their name from Fabian, the Roman general who coined the phrase, "We'll kill him with 1,000 cuts," right? They don't mind playing the long game. Yeah. And I'm not sure how you counter that. Maybe we'll get into that a little later. But yeah, I'm sure with Arrington being moved to BYU, he was like, "You're kidding, right? I mean, you're gonna." Oh, okay, here we go. Right.
Yeah, right. Well, see, and I do want to go into that for a second. Conservatives always seem to fight in politics. It doesn't work. The progressives are brilliant. What do they go after? They go after the education and the media and the news. So what do they go after? They go after Hollywood. They go after the government schools. And then, like for Arrington, he's like, I'm going to go rewrite the history. It's brilliant. I'm trying to remember... the name is leaving my mind, but the one who wrote the playwright who wrote The Crucible, which is a book that just denigrates the Puritans, and he actually had connections with communism, and so he basically left the country for a time, but he did an interview which was so fascinating because he said, they've limited my influence for a time, but he said, I know how to write plays and they don't. So I'm going to win this game in the long run, right? So it's because people have got to understand, it's like Jesus Christ, how did he teach? He taught through stories. He taught through helping people connect things. He taught through symbolism. And we've honestly, as a whole, I mean, I'm overgeneralizing here because there are some great people that have done great films and stuff, but we need more people that are realizing the battle that we're in. The battle that we need to understand, the stakes that are being played, the difference in the worldviews, what the ideologies are, really the difference between the two sides, and then how to teach that in a way that will reach people. You know, if Joseph Smith was alive today, I don't think he would write books. I think he would go make movies. I think he would write curriculum. That is what he would do.
That's so funny you should say that, because just a couple days ago, the episode I'll release on Saturday is a Mormon fundamentalist who worked in Hollywood, who is now making movies, trying to make movies that teach correct history. So I think look, if there's one thing that I've noticed throughout Scripture is that God loves a dramatic ending.
Yes, he does.
Right? And so for a long time, I've been a little pessimistic, right? I've been a little like, oh, we're so screwed. We're done, right? Pack it in, stick a fork in us, we're done. But I just, from doing this podcast and talking to people, from folks in the LDS Church to independent fundamentalists to other groups, I just have this feeling we're all about to stand up at the right time. And somehow this will be stemmed. But you're right. Oftentimes we don't realize we're in a war until it's at the front door.
Yes.
Right? And because I think we tend to want to think the best about everybody. And so we're like, oh, they're just trying to do the best they can. Meanwhile, we don't see it. We don't understand it. And by the time we do, now we gotta go because there's not time.
Right. And I think, honestly, that's one of the number one reasons that we're actually losing our kids. I mean, we can talk about the music and the culture plays a big role. And that's something that we have a big part of the Joseph Smith Foundation trying to teach better standards and better culture. But a lot of it is we don't engage our kids in seeing that this is a real war and that they have a part in this and that they can they can build up something better, and that they had, and the need is now. I just want to share, like, I love what you said about being pessimistic. And if I can find it just here in the book, we have a prophecy from Heber C. Kimball. Let's see, let me just find it here. Yes. Okay. So, which you might remember. I don't. This is probably one of my favorite quotes.
Yep. I know where you're going.
And so, but it starts really back when Joseph Smith was in Liberty Jail, and the Lord tells him, right, he's so depressed because he's got the 3 witnesses have turned on him, his best friends have turned on him, the people are being driven from the state of Missouri, they're being persecuted, like it looks like things are over, right? And the Lord tells him a promise. He says that his people would never be turned against him by the testimony of traitors, which I think is interesting. Just that's something to ponder about. But Heber C. Kimball made this prophecy. He said that at present, the prophet Joseph's boys lay apparently in a state of slumber.
Wow.
10 virgins, right?
Wow.
He says everything seems to be perfectly calm with them, right? All is well in Zion, like we're all good. There's not a war going on. But he says, but by and by, God will wake them up and they will roar like the thunders of Mount Sinai. And then this is the fascinating part. He says, there's much work to be done. God is not asleep, and he will wake up our children, and they will bear off this kingdom to the nations of the earth. And what will they do? So what are we going to do, right? To win this war? He says they'll bear testimony to the truth of this work and to the integrity and true character of Joseph Smith. And he also names Brigham and Heber and others, but I think that's so fascinating, the true character of Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith's character is going to be under attack in the last days, basically, he's saying, and everyone's going to be asleep, and then they're going to wake up one day and realize, holy cow, when did this happen?
Yeah.
Right? And what is the truth? Because people come all the time, and they're like, well, I read Rough Stone Rolling, and I didn't feel good about it, but I don't know how to counter it. You're like, guys, it's not real history. Here's the facts. Here's the data so that you can go out and fight. But we need people to realize, okay, this is the real history. And we need people to stand up and say, okay, this is who Joseph Smith really was. And we need it done through plays and through music and through movies and through books and stories and curriculum. And we can't let this die.
No.
The restoration will die if we roll over and die with it.
Yeah. And we have to meet... We have to meet those who oppose true history, traditional history, on that field.
Yes.
We have to fight for the culture.
Yes.
One of the things I've noticed for a long time, and it was something that I brought out years and years ago, and I remember someone looked at me like I had a third arm growing out of my head, but I said, Mormonism was kind of meant to be a counterculture, right? It wasn't meant to be just another church or just another religious movement. No. This was different. This was a different society. This was coming out of Zion. Out of Babylon. Yeah. This was doing something different. Unlike any other American church that had come forward before or since then, we were meant to be different. So we should have our own culture. We should have our own music. We should have our own customs and all those things, because that's really what it was about to begin with. I think we have, and I say we as Mormons in general, every stripe and flavor, we have, a lot of us, not all of us, I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but we've all, I think, took our eyes off Zion a little bit, right? But when you go back and you look at Joseph Smith, you know how many just chapels Joseph built? Anyone want to take a guess? Zero. Temples and communities.
Right.
And until we get back to that idea of a community, this idea of a separate culture, I don't think we're achieving what it is we were supposed to be aiming for.
Yeah, so people don't understand. This is, Joseph Smith was so clear, right? He was like, what are we doing? We're restoring Israel. And that doesn't mean just it's a spiritual, nice, warm, fuzzy thing. It's a culture. It's a civilization. It's literal blood. It's literal heritage. It's a real city and everything that's tangible, right? And I like that you're bringing this up, because literally, probably almost to the day, a year ago, when my dad was in the hospital, right days before he passed away, he and I were actually talking about this in the hospital, and he just grabbed my hand and he was like, Hannah, he was like, you got to tell people we're trying to build Israel again. We're trying, and it's a real thing, and it's a real city, and it's a real culture, and that's what our kids don't understand. They think this is all. I think that's one of the reasons we're losing our kids, is because we make it all about as if it's spiritual, it's intangible, it's nothing. It's warm and fuzzy, right? And then they go off to school, and there's the science teacher who's like, well, that's nice, you got the fairy tales, you want the real science? Like, let's actually put this in the test tube. Right. Let's actually go make a movie. Let's go actually do photography, write magazines. Let's teach you how to write. Let's teach you how to go change the world. And they're like, okay, yeah, this is what I want. I don't want something that means nothing. And so we've got to help. We've got to have a paradigm shift where we've got to understand. And this is where it goes back to Joseph Smith's teachings. And this is why it's so, because Joseph Smith taught that. When he was setting up Nauvoo, and he's setting up Missouri, and he's setting up Kirtland, he's setting up real cities, and he told the saints, like in Nauvoo, he said, we're going to have our own military, and we're going to have our own schools, and we're going to have our own fashion, and our own plays, and our own music, and our own dances. Let's do this. This is exciting, guys. This is not about doom and gloom and debating endless debates about doctrine, right? Let's move past that and actually let's build Zion. And the people weren't ready to. But I think we got to have that aspect. This is beautiful, and this is exciting. So
absolutely. So, real quick, where do you feel we're at right now with this? With getting back to the revisionist history, where are we at in the process? How far down the road are we?
We are probably at one of the most decisive moments in the history of the Restoration since the days of Joseph Smith. I think this generation is going to decide whether we keep it or lose it, because our history has been pretty much completely rewritten. The documents are disappearing online. Like, for all we talk about transparency, people really do not have access to even our history a ton.
Why is that? Let's explain that first. What do you mean we don't have history, access to our history?
Right. Well, I would say one, people are starting to not value it, because as we move down this road of, okay, well, why would we listen to Joseph Smith? The Joseph Smith in Rough Stone Rolling is basically a bumbling buffoon. Mm-hmm. Why would anyone care 2 cents what he said about women, about economics, about family life, about society, about culture? Nobody cares. And that's why nobody really studies his teaching. So a number of years ago, our team with the Joseph Smith Foundation sat down and we're like, why do we not have all of Joseph Smith's teachings organized by topic? Like, it's been quite a way. It's been
a little while.
It's been a little while. It's almost been 200 years since the Restoration, the church was founded, and we don't even have Joseph Smith's teachings organized by topic. How can that be? How can that be? And so we've actually been working on that, and we're actually getting ready to release it end of September. This is 2022 when we're recording this. Well, it's beginning of September 2022, but we'll have it released by the end of September. Is a first pass, phase 1 of Joseph Smith's teachings, all organized by topic, freely accessible, so people can actually go see what he taught. So people can, for those that care. And so number one, there is an element where we're just not making that history accessible in a way that people can actually digest. Because yes, you can go read the Joseph Smith papers, but that's not very user friendly for the common member. It's hard to read. If you're a scholar, if you're a researcher, you know what to go and look for. But if you're just an average member, you're not going to find it.
Yeah, they're divided up the way they are because for a reason.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And well, it's very academic.
It's very academic. It's very dry. So unless you are a complete nerd, which I am,
yes.
They're not going to be. It's not a juicy read, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
I think people gravitated towards Rough Stone Rolling because it was a juicy read, so to speak, right?
Yes. And then just to finish answering your question, the history that we do have is progressive rewriting of history. So let's take Eliza R. Snow. All of the biographies out there on her life are written by progressives and by women who are going to be interpreting her through a feministic lens, which for them, Eliza R. Snow is a conundrum. Because on the one hand, she's so independent and she is so strong, and at the same time, she's so submissive that they can't figure her out. She is an enigma. And it's because you can't understand Eliza without understanding her worldview. And we need a traditionalist history on her. I want to do her biography. I fully intend to. But our girls are growing up without female role models because they don't have the history. They don't have the example. And I went through this myself a number of years ago. I was sitting with a group of women and I told them, I said, I've been pondering this. I don't know what it means to be a good mom. Like, I don't feel like I really understand from God's perspective what is true womanhood, true motherhood. What does that really mean? Because I know what all the different factions mean of different extremes, right? I know what the people with the pink aprons, and I know what the feminists say, and all these different, I want to know what God says. I want to know what that perspective is. And I don't think that perspective's been told. And I think the reason why it hasn't been told is because we haven't even told our history. It's in our history. It's in these women like Eliza R. Snow, like Helen Mar Kimball. That was one of the fun things about writing about Helen Mar Kimball's story, is she really getting into her personality, who she was as a mother, who she was as a writer, how she thought, who she was as a person, how she struggled with health challenges, losing children. Let's tell these real stories, and yes, I agree with the progressives on this thing. Let's not hide the history. Let's not overgeneralize it. Let's get beyond the Sunday school version. Let's do that. Let's get into the nitty-gritty details. Let's talk about Helen Mar Kimball struggling through chronic illness and struggling through just different bouts of anxiety, and possibly you could even say depression and discouragement. Let's talk about it, and let's talk about how she got through it and how she kept her faith. I want to know that real history. I want to know the nitty-gritty details, because there's nothing to be afraid of. It will be faith promoting because it will point to God.
What did you take away from writing about her? I know it's kind of an aside from what we were talking about, but I'm curious now.
Probably that, how to be, getting into her story showed me that she was someone who had a real story like me, you could say. I'm not saying I've lived through everything she has, sure, but saying she struggled, and getting into her mind, because when you actually get into her diaries, you can actually see, oh, this is a real person, a mother that was staying up all night, stressed about her kids leaving the church. She had a daughter that married someone who wasn't a member of the church, and she begged and she pleaded with her, and that was so hard. And she had another daughter that was struggling with her testimony. She's literally having a severe health challenge, and she's on the couch and she's begging her kids, like, don't lose your faith. Keep the Sabbath day holy, right? So for a parent that's worried or stayed up late nights worrying about a child who's struggling with their testimony, Helen Mar Kimball was there, and she talked about it. And she was also someone who had doubts, who was wondering, I don't know about this whole idea of plural marriage. I don't know if I believe this. I don't know how to go through losing my kids. So she lost her first 3 children on the first in winter quarters and the second on the trek to Utah. And she had such severe, you could probably say, postpartum depression, and then also just depression from losing the kids, and the sickness of the trek, that she almost died, and she wanted to die. And she talks about her experience. It's almost like an Alma the Younger experience, but she's very real. She's transparent. She's raw. She's raw. And that's what I loved about it, because I was like, I am sick of the fluff. I want to know the real raw stories. I want to know about the trials. I want to know about the doubts, because I want to know how to get through it and what the answers are. And I think people need those stories today. People need to know, let's not pretend like everything's fine. Let's actually talk about, okay, how does the gospel of Jesus Christ answer to these problems? And for Helen Mar Kimball, it was a perspective of a woman. So instead of just reading, okay, here's a principle, it was from a woman's perspective. How did she get through it? That was honestly the funnest part for me.
That's awesome. That is cool. Let me ask you this. We talked a few moments ago about we haven't done a good job telling our kids what's really going on.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
How do we fix that?
Okay, so I'm gonna start by saying this is another huge topic. I'll share a few things that work for our family. There's so many things, but we actually just wrote a book about this called A Christ-Centered Home, kind of telling the story behind the Joseph Smith Foundation and how it was a dad with a bunch of his kids that did this. But one of the things is not being afraid to talk to our kids about the good and the bad and the ugly. Too often we want to pretend like, well, that's negative. We don't want to talk about the negative stuff. We don't want to talk about the negative scriptures. We don't want to talk about negative history. Like, no, sit down with your 15-year-old or your even 13-year-old and talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the full story. I mean, you don't have to read every gory detail, right? I mean, it's a little graphic if you go read all the original accounts, but talk about what really happened and talk about, okay, this is a story where there were state presidents and leaders that pressured members into doing it through their authority and said, as your priesthood leaders were telling you to do this, and massacred men, women, and children under a false truce. Like, that's going to be hard for people to swallow, and so sit down with your kids and say, but this is how we understand it through the gospel. This is where they went wrong. They were following a path of blind obedience. This is what Joseph Smith taught. You see, if they had followed Joseph Smith's teachings about war, this never would have happened. If they had followed what Brigham Young taught, this never would have happened. Let's talk about what was going on in the context with the Utah War and forgiveness, and literally weeks before, I think it was George A. Smith had been visiting that area and told them, forgive. You cannot hold anger in your hearts. Anyways, go into the whole story, right? Sit down with your kids and talk about it. Talk about the Donner Party. Talk about how Wilford Woodruff said some of the members of the Donner Party were actually former persecutors of the saints. Let's talk about this. And that was something I was so grateful that my dad did growing up, is we talked about communism when we got into the history, but it was all from the perspective of understanding it from God's point of view. So it was never depressing and disgusting or hopeless. It was, okay, here's the good, the bad, the ugly. Here's where we've succeeded. Here's where we've failed. Now let's take that knowledge to go make a difference. Now we can understand our times better and go do a difference, make a difference. And then 2, I would say every parent needs to figure out what their family mission is. So we always talk a lot of times at different education circles about people having individual missions, like, oh, go help your kids figure out your missions. Well, if you look in the scriptures, everything is about family missions. Right? So Lehi doesn't just have Lehi's mission, he has a mission for his whole family. Alma goes and takes his sons with him when he goes to preach to the Zoramites. With the whole Ram-Yumtum story, it was a dad and his boys going on that mission. We forget about that perspective. The sons of Mosiah, they're brothers. It's a family going on a mission to convert the Lamanites. We don't think this way anymore. It's so counter to our culture where it's just, we've fragmented everyone, but instead sitting down and saying, okay, every family, and I do believe this, I believe every family was sent down with a purpose to do together. And I would say our family could have never done any of these books and DVDs without every single one of my siblings. Every single one of them was needed. Every single one of them was essential with their different talents. To this day, when I'm even working on my books or articles or even my Facebook posts or anything, like, I talk to my sister, and because she thinks different than I do, and she has perspective that is absolutely needed. I would fail in my mission without her help, and she would fail in her mission without the rest of our family. Like, families were meant to work together, and kids need to feel that. They need to feel they're important. They need to feel like we were sent together as a team to do this. Let's go build Zion. Let's go do it. Why wait?
My wife, who is just way better than I am, I remember, I want to say it was about 7-8 years ago, she just came and she said, we need to have a family mission statement.
I love it.
And so we sat down, and I remember we talked about it, and we got everybody's input, and we came up with one. We even developed a family slogan, which was, all it takes is all you got. Right? And what happened in that process is that we got really united really quickly, right? We understood we have a chart, we've charted a path, now we got to go.
Right.
And I think you're 100% correct. Somehow, I think that as a society, we've allowed our families to kind of be pulled apart a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? And what's been so interesting to me was it was never bad stuff most of the time. right? It was never, hey, Johnny's out back smoking a joint, right? It was always, well, we got football and we got band and we have all these other things, right? And for the most part, you can't say they were bad things.
Right.
They were just things, right? And you're trying to keep your kids active, and we live in a society now where people feel like it takes two incomes, and so mom's working and dad's working, and you're just stretched apart.
Yep. And moms are mostly just chauffeurs driving from like ballet, and then we got to go to this friend and then this friend and this co-op.
And so I remember as me and my wife faced this, we said, okay, we got to do something different, right? And we're going to be weird and we're going to look strange, but that's okay, because we were seeing it. We were feeling it. And I didn't like it and she didn't like it. So we finally just said, each kid gets one, right? You got to pick one, because we can't just do this. We're missing out. We come to a point as people where we have to make hard decisions. And I believe the hardest of decisions is always choosing between what's good or even great and what is vital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's in making those decisions, when you choose the side of what's vital,
right,
that you begin to get yourself square again.
Yes. And I don't want people to misinterpret that as like, okay, kill all the activities, kill the recreation, right? But it's from this perspective, and that's why it's so important to understand that building Israel, gathering Israel, and building Zion is building a culture, right? Because like in our home, so my dad just loved dance. And so he was like, okay, there's a lot of dances that are very corrupt. Right. So he's like, well, let's restore it. Right? We need recreation. We need something to unstring the bow, as Brigham Young would say. Let's restore it. Let's go study out the dances. Let's go study out Jane Austen dances. Let's go study out square dancing. Let's go study out earlier. And I bought all the DVDs back in the day when people had DVD players, right? And I was like, let's watch these. And he was like, okay, now let's get together with friends and let's teach each other these dances and let's do this. Simple, actually. Like, it sounds maybe like, oh my goodness, that would be so much work, but actually just sit down with your family once or twice a week and dance together, and then get together with other families and your friends and be like, let's learn this. And you are literally starting the redemption of Zion right there in your home, in that area. So it can be fun, it can be exciting, it can be like, let's sit down and let's restore our food, the way we eat. Let's figure out how to do this. So I have some siblings, like, they love to cook, right? So that's their expertise. It's not necessarily my expertise. That's not my favorite thing to do, but they love to do it. So it's like, okay, well, let's go study out these different spices and different cultures, and let's figure out, how would an Israelite eat? What does this culture look like? And just involve your kids and communicate that to them. Okay, now guys, let's go share this on a blog so other people can find it. And then all of a sudden, now they're missionaries to go out there and spread a better culture.
Yep. Your dad was a lot nicer to you guys than I was to my kids, especially my boys. So it was always a party at the Sanders house. I made my boys sit down and go through with me Washington's rules for gentlemen and decent behavior. We went through that.
We did those too.
Did you really?
Yes, we did.
Now, what was cool, though, is when my boys started dating, and like, they're like,
culture shock.
Yeah, because they're getting up when she comes to the table after she's left, and they're pulling out the chairs, and they're watching how they sit and how they conduct themselves. And so it was interesting to watch them just wither in pain as we were going through those, right? But then all of a sudden it pays off, and it's like,
yes.
And I was like, the old man had something, didn't I? Yes. They were like, whatever. Fine, yeah, you had something.
We just have to communicate to our kids the why.
Right.
And that was one of the other things, and I was just thinking about this, actually. I was going to bring this, I teach gospel doctrine, so I was actually going to work this into my lesson. But like, in a home, too often parents are like, well, this is the rule, and it's because I said, and this is what we do, and because otherwise you're stupid or whatever. But it works a lot better if you sit down and you say, okay, any rule we have, can you back it up with scripture? So that was a phrase that we kids would use on each other, or even like with our mom and dad, like, wait, can you back that up with scripture? Like, because they'd be like, well, God is the one that's running this house. The parents have to submit to God, just like the children are being taught to submit and honor. But God's the one that sets the rules. So music we listen to, the movies, it needs to go back to scriptural principles and scriptural standards. So now some of my friends and I use that with each other. In fact, it gets used against me quite often when I'll say something, and one of my friends will be like, "Can you back that up with a scripture?" And I'm like, "Give me a minute and I will."
So how do we combat this and I'm sorry, I'm taking it back to the rewriting of Mormon
back
history.
to our real topic.
Yeah. How do we combat that? Because look, a lot of us don't have time to sit down and start pouring through old journals, right?
Yes.
The other thing, that's the first part. How do we get involved that way? How do we make meaningful contributions to correct the narrative? Next, how do you fight this new narrative when the perpetrators of that new narrative are college professors, men with PhDs? How do you fight that battle when they look at you and say, you don't have a degree in history, you don't know how to do real research? How those two questions are weighing heavy on my mind.
Okay, both of those are really good questions. Okay, so the first one, I think the real answer is that you have to get down on your knees and you have to ask God what your part is. And every person's part is needed. You know, people can look at what we're doing at the Joseph Smith Foundation and be like, oh my goodness, that's so amazing, I could never do something like that. No, your part is just as important. Even if you're not writing a book or making a documentary or something, even just sharing it or learning your piece or, you know, whatever it might be, whatever your gifts or talents are. I mean, right here you have a podcast. Other people, it might be just teaching their friends in their co-op if they homeschool. For other people, even if their kids are going to public school, it may be sitting down and saying, okay, we're just going to start watching good movies with our kids. That's one of the reasons we did ZionTube on our website. So it's a movie database of every good movie we could find. I think we have like 400 to 500 movies on there that are very clean, like especially by today's standards, exceptionally clean, and actually teach good principles. Sit down, watch these. There's movies that teach the history behind communist Russia, stories of persecuted Christians. Those stories will inspire your kids, and they'll create testimonies that can't be shaken because they'll start understanding history from the right perspective, and the character will come with it. But to answer your question on like what can people do because they don't have time to go through all the journals. Well, one, that's why we're trying to do what we're doing. That's the whole goal behind the Joseph Smith Foundation is we're trying to take mounds of archives, of libraries of research and consolidate it to say, okay, here's a book on Helen Mar Kimball. You can just read this book. Here's these books on the faith crisis. You can understand the difference between traditional and progressive. Here's this documentary on temple symbolism. So you can understand the compass and the square and all these symbols that Joseph Smith restored. And also, if you're feeling like you need to do something, you have to get down on your knees and you have to ask God and you have to be sincere and willing to follow through on the answer. You know, you have to be willing to follow the direction. But if you do, I can promise you, like, God will open doors to do things you never dreamed possible. My dad started this when I was 10. He ended up having 10 kids, had health challenges. He was trying to work full time most of his life. A lot of other family issues. We're like any other family out there. We've gone through a lot. But you know what? Just trying to do the right thing and being open to God's leading led to miracles, to being able to accomplish all this. And it would never have been possible without his help. There is no way we could have done any of these books or these documentaries on our own strength. And so if we'll have faith, if we'll sit down and say, okay, God, we believe that you can help us turn this Titanic around. We can do this. We have to do this. If we don't do this, we're not building Zion, right? We're going to build Zion, period. We're going to. So how do we do that? What's my piece? What do I do? And God will open the way to do that. Second question. You're going to have to remind me what it was.
How do you combat this idea that you're not a college trained professor? You don't have a PhD in history. You haven't seen the things I have seen. How do you combat that?
I think the best thing is teaching your kids how to go get the answers themselves. So instead of relying on mom or relying on dad, teach them, okay, here, you go do the research. Here's the sources. And that's one of the reasons, like even in our faith crisis books or the Sears Don't Be Your Thumbum or any of them, we put the footnotes right at the bottom of the page. Because we were like, instead of making you go dig for them in the back, I hate when people do that. It's so hard to do research. Yes. We're like, we're going to do it right there at the page. You go look it up. You can go find it. Go check it out for yourself. Don't take anything we're saying for granted. But so I did my first research project when I was 13. And it was working on helping pull together every known statement from a president of the church on creation, science, evolution, Darwinism, Adam, Eve, anything to do with that whole debate, to pull it together in one collection. So that's what we have on the Joseph Smith Foundation. It's the only place I know of that has every known statement by a president of the church on the whole science debate, organized, formatted, so people can actually find it. I did that when I was 13. And you know what it taught me? Because we did it for our school, right? And so my dad's like, forget the stupid worksheets. Like, you don't care about them. Do you care about doing them, Hannah? No. Do you want to do them? No. I don't want you to do them. Like, let's do something valuable. So that was kind of exciting because every kid wants to feel like they're doing something real, you know? Yep. They want to feel like this is important and this matters. And but not only that, but it taught me I know how to go look this stuff up. So if I'm wondering about something, even something that I remember taking a speech and debate class, and there were a bunch of kids that were making some comments about politics. I think that was during the whole debate with Obama and everything. I don't even remember. But anyways, so they were debating something, and I was like, I'm going to go look that up. Because I'm not even going to take what they're saying for granted, but I knew how to go look that up. And so when you teach, it helps kids see that this isn't rocket science. Right? So we get scared and intimidated by degrees, but when you realize you can go look that up just like that scholar can. You can go look up that research paper. You have a brain. You figure this out. This actually isn't complicated. Rocket science is complicated. I have two uncles that do that. It's complicated. I don't understand half the things they're saying most of the time. But this is not. History is not. We can talk about this. You can understand it. And I think just even talking to your kids that way, instead of like, well, you're a kid. No, you're intelligent. You're becoming an adult. At 12, 13, 14, I'm going to talk to you like you are an adult. You can figure this out. Let's go figure this out together. Kids will respond to that. I think we have to realize, like, God is sending down. We've been told over and over, oh, these are some of the greatest spirits to come down to the earth are coming down at this time. Yet we're losing more than we've ever lost. I think people should think about that. It's not the kids' fault. Our kids will respond if we teach them truth. And that was something else that my dad was always big on. He was always like, we need to use scriptural terms and scriptural words because that's what the kids will respond to, because that's the language that they heard in the premortal life. Right? Yeah. They didn't hear psychological words. They heard scripture. They heard the voice of God. So if we'll use those words and if we'll use that terminology, their spirits will respond. And there's going to be a few Lamans and Lemuels. Got it. Seen it, lived it, you know. Sure. But our kids, for the most part, are good kids, and they're being sent down at this time for this fight. So help them discover what their place is. And I have seen that change hearts. Honestly, myself and my siblings, every single one of us went through different conversion processes in completely different ways. Some of us took longer than others. Some of us struggled in different ways. But ultimately, most of us got that testimony. The gospel works. We've got to have faith that it works. And we've got to have faith that if we speak to our kids and the Lord helps us do that, and we help communicate to them and see, okay, you can do this, that the kids will respond. I don't know if that helps.
Absolutely. I think you hit on a really important point, and that was kind of start treating your kids as an adult when they get to that 12 or 13-year-old stage.
Yes.
I think we tend to look at our kids and like, he's just a kid or she's just a kid. But it wasn't that long ago that Washington was Fairfax County, Virginia surveyor, right? County surveyor at 16 years old.
Yes.
Right? So he's traipsing across the wilderness, dragging a chain and a theodolite to map it.
Yes.
Right? I have found, on the times I have been a good dad, I have found that my kids will respond when I tell them I expect it.
Right.
And too often I think that their lack of achievement is more a reflection of a dad who didn't expect enough and didn't help them reach those expectations. That's been my experience. And so don't sell your kids short.
Yes.
I mean, they're way more intelligent than we give them credit for.
Yes.
They pick up a lot more than we give them credit for.
And I think helping them see that they can achieve more if they use the Lord's help. Like, I'm going to say, of everything I've done in my life, none of it would have been possible without the Lord's help. Period.
Yeah.
I don't care. And we would always laugh about that as siblings. Because I was 18 when we released our first documentary. So we're basically teenagers when we're sitting together at these expo tables, and my dad would have us run the expo table. You know, you go sell the products, you talk to the customers, right? You help do it. And people would come up sometimes and they'd be like, wow, like, you guys must be so talented. And we would always laugh because we'd be like, are you kidding me? If you could see the behind the scenes of us in our pajamas trying to figure out how to work Premiere Pro. Some days it was a disaster. So, but seeing those miracles and honestly, as a child, being pushed to get down on my knees and pray and say, God, I don't know how to do this.
Right.
I don't know how to write a book. I don't know how to do research. I don't know how to find this. Can you help me? And then getting ideas teaches kids, like, God is real and you can do this. Nephi was very young when he did what he did, but he couldn't have done it without the Lord's help. And so again, it just makes the kids, okay, instead of reading about the scriptures, let's live the scriptures. Let's be like them. And it is possible. It's not just like, oh, no one could ever be like Nephi. Why not?
He was a guy too.
He
who
was.
Lamented about his own shortcomings and failings. You know, the Psalm of Nephi. I mean, I think sometimes, and we look at these heroes, and for some reason we want to turn them into marble rather than see who they are.
Well, we want to see them as real people, right? So this is, okay, I'm glad you brought this up because this is a big, so progressives are always going to be like, well, we want to see like the flaws. We got to pull Joseph Smith off his pedestal. That's what they always say, right? And it's, so the adversary always uses pieces of truth mixed with a lie, right? Yep. So the true aspect of it is we need to see them as people, right? I want, instead of just hearing, oh, Helen Mar Kimball got a testimony and lived the gospel, like, I want to know what it was really like when she lost her kids. I want to know what it was like when she buried her baby in winter quarters as a teenage mother. You know, I want to know what it was like when she struggled and when she doubted. I want to know what it was like. I remember I was working on the Seer Stone Urim and Thummim book, which is on the translation of the Book of Mormon, at the same age that Joseph Smith was when he was translating the Book of Mormon. And I remember thinking about that as I was writing the manuscript, because I was like, what I'm doing is easy compared to what he was doing. So easy. I don't know how he did that. But it gave me insight as I was studying the translation in how he did it and the spiritual experiences he was having. And we go into that in the translation of the Book of Mormon. It was a translation. Joseph Smith was learning the language. He was having visions of the culture. It wasn't just a dictation. He's a prophet, seer, and revelator, not a prophet, seer, and reader.
Right.
And he talks about Nephi's coming to him, and Mormon and Moroni, and they're explaining their culture. He's seeing their mode of travel. He's doing a translation, and so it was just fascinating to come to see him as a real person, with real thoughts and struggles, with pain, feels real emotions, and then at the same time, though, understand. We do need heroes. So in our culture today, we are devoid of heroes. Because everybody wants to just say it's okay to be mediocre. We're just going to tear everyone down. Instead of realizing there are people like Joseph Smith that didn't give in.
Right.
So you don't have to give in either. There's people like Helen Mar Kimball that struggled. She was not the same caliber as an Eliza or Snow. But her story needs to be told because people are going to... I'm not anyway the caliber of any of them. So all of them, but they show me different examples. Okay, Eliza R. Snow is, here's her character status. Here's Helen Mar Kimball. So you can see what they really went through, but at the same time realizing we don't need to tear down heroes. We just want to see the real history. Does that make sense?
That makes absolute sense. Because one of the things I love about reading the scriptures is that oftentimes the humanity comes through. Mm-hmm. I think of Peter, right? One moment, he's like, oh no, there's no way they're getting to Jesus. We're going to pick up swords. We're going to go to town. I'll never deny you. And then 30 minutes later, he's like, I don't know who he is. I've never seen the man before in my life. It's seeing that, right? And then understanding, look at what he did after that.
And this is how to get there.
And that will map our way of getting there.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that is...
Same with the sons of Mosiah, right?
Yeah.
Okay, when they turned, this is how they turned, this is how they repaired, this is where they got, and that's possible.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think keeps people from engaging? Because I think everybody knows, right? On some level, there is something in everybody. Mm-hmm. If you get them alone and you talk to them, everybody knows something's not right. Mm-hmm. And even those who understand what's not right, don't necessarily engage in the fight.
Yes. Most of them don't.
What keeps people out of it, in your opinion?
Okay, so every person is different. Mm-hmm. There is an aspect that... Okay, so we just released a couple weeks ago a music fireside. It's free on YouTube. It's called Discover Music. So my dad would do music firesides just talking about the impact of rock music and culture and really breaking it down to talking about how to analyze music and the emotion behind it and everything. I do believe that our culture plays a big part in just deadening people spiritually and introducing apathy, and I think a lot of that is connected to the music and the movies. And I say that because I have seen over and over and over when someone started purging out and just raising those standards, they come alive. I have literally seen kids that were dead, teenage boys that were so apathetic, they were in full rebellion with their parents, and they cleaned up their music and their movies, and they became like completely different people, you know? So there's an aspect of understanding if you're trying to do this with your kids and trying to engage them, and you try to do it with the Babylonian culture, and you try to keep the music and the movies and try to do it too, you're going to lose. If you're going to try to compete with the world, you're never going to. The world is always going to be more cool, and it's going to be more fun. So that is something I would just... If anyone's interested, they can look into that because it's pretty fascinating. Another layer is I do think sometimes people feel fear because they say, well, I can't take Richard Bushman on. When in 2016, we published a blog article on our LDS Answers website challenging rough stone rolling and the progressive scholars. This was before we wrote any of our books. And that was the first time anyone had officially challenged the new narrative. Like out there just said, guys, this is nonsense. We're taking this on. And I saw people online. They were like, what in the world? Like, who are these people? I think they are, you know. And I think because people were scared. They're like, well, who would take Richard Bushman on? Like, he's got 1 million degrees, right? His biography, I mean, look at it. It's huge and it's thick. Like, I don't know that much, you know? So there is an element of fear. There's fear to take on that Goliath. There's fear to, and that's where faith comes in, where we have to have more faith as a people. We have to get down on our knees and we have to say, God, I'm willing to do this. What do I do? I'm willing to do whatever it takes, you know? And then the other aspect is I think people need to understand the consequences. And that's where more education comes in. We need to show people why the history matters. We need to show, okay, This is how we've gotten off in our history of the nation. Here's how we've gotten off in our history of the church. It's having consequences. People are going to suffer if you don't get involved. Not something we got to teach our kids. Your life is not about you.
Right.
And there's people that are hurting, and one day you're going to look those people in the face on the other side. And they're either going to say, thank you, you changed my life, and generations are now saved, or they're going to come up to you and say, you knew, why didn't you tell me?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how you get to this point, but I remember when I started this, right? I don't know how to do this, right? I'm a clown with a microphone. I have no business doing this. But I remember distinctly when I was looking at my computer. I remember I brought a new computer home. I brought microphones home, and my wife's like, "What are you doing?" And I told her, and she said, "Well, you've done stupider things, so let me know how this works." But I think, as I remember looking at it and understanding that this would get personal, right? That I'm going to have skin in the game now. Yeah. I'm about to go throw my voice into the ether and confess to everybody that I'm a Mormon fundamentalist, right? And I remember going, I don't know if I want to do this, right? I mean, I'm by nature a pretty private guy. So to do this, that's just bat crap crazy. I don't know how else to put it. But I remember there were two words that came to me. Reckless abandon. Just go all in. Don't hold back. Yeah. And I know it's uncomfortable. I get it. I get it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But if we're going to win this thing, we're going to need God's help, and we're going to have to go forward with absolutely no fear.
Right.
Or I shouldn't say that. With a lot of courage. I'm scared every time I do this, right? I mean, that's always going to be there. But being able to recognize it and go ahead and do it anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you have to be 100% committed, and you have to know. And I've had those times in my life where I got down and I'm like, okay, God, like I need to know from you. I want to know 100%. And honestly, the two things that every day when I don't want to do something, what drives me and gives me the strength to do it is, one, knowing what God wants me to do. Number one, having that call that you feel, or that confidence of like, okay, like God wants us to defend the gospel. God wants us to preach the gospel. And this, but number two, knowing that people need help.
Yeah.
That is, I think for me, that's what gives me the strength to keep going when I'm sick and I can't keep going. I've had chronic health challenges most of my life. There's days I don't want to get out of bed, but what always has helped me is thinking, okay, there's someone out there, even one person. And if one person gets helped, it's worth it because they need help. And this can change someone's life. So I was talking to a friend about this actually a week ago, because I said, sometimes it's really, really hard. And she said, Hannah, you don't know this, but you making that choice changed my life. And she started telling me, and she was like, do you remember when you came to my house once, whatever number of years ago, and this is who I was, and this is where I was, and this is how I thought. And now being able, honestly, through the scriptures and through Joseph Smith, and that just opened the door to their family making tons of changes. And she was like, I wouldn't know who I was. I wouldn't, my life would be completely different, she said, if you hadn't done this. And that just reminded me. I was like, okay, that's one person. That makes it worth it. And I think our culture is so selfishly driven, but we've got to raise our kids and we've got to teach our kids and we've got to remind ourselves, Jesus Christ came to earth and he laid down his life. And that's what we're commanded to do. We're commanded to love one another just as Christ loved us. And if we can have that perspective, if we can look in the world, that is honestly what gives me the courage to get up and do things that scare me to death. Is because I'm like, someone needs this help. And we can do this.
Absolutely. We don't know the effect we're going to have on somebody else.
No.
We just don't.
And we might not ever know in this life.
No. I remember when I knew that I was onto something doing this, and it freaked me out. It freaked me out horribly. I was in bed and I couldn't sleep real well. And this was right after Under the Banner of Heaven came out. And I sat down with a friend of mine who was Mormon as well, and we dove deep into all these things, right? I mean, it was a 3-hour podcast. And we took apart blood atonement, and we talked about it, and what was Brigham saying, and what was the context. And I got a message at about 2:30 in the morning, and I don't know why I was awake. I had to get up early the next morning, but for whatever reason, it woke me up. And I looked at it, and it was someone who was saying, me and my husband watched that, and we hadn't been to church in 2 weeks because we were freaked out because we didn't know what we'd signed up for. That's what's important, right? And we're never going to see, we're never going to understand here how it is that what we do sends ripples into eternity. But it does.
It does.
And if there's one thing that's been frustrating, it's been seeing people with amazing stories who just won't engage, right? And I'm like, you got so much to offer. You got so much to offer. So I think you're right. Knowing that there's someone out there that's going to benefit from it, and then just put that fear and just go for it.
Go for it.
Go for it. Don't look back. Don't just keep your head down and just charge.
I mean, to be honest, like, people see what the Joseph Smith Foundation is today, realize in 2005, none of that existed. It was a dad, and my brother passed away, and it was kind of in that process of shortly before and after that, just felt impressed. Like, do video. My dad's like, I've never touched a video camera before. Kind of like you with your equipment. Like, he was like, I don't know anything about this. What do you mean do video? So he was looking in, like, do I go to film school? Figured out pretty quick, you can't keep your soul in film school. Like, you can't. Like, but it's so pornographic, and it's so trashy. And my dad was like, I'm not going there. I'm just not going there. I'm not going to risk that. And so he figured out ways to buy tutorials and watch them at home, and self-taught, and had us learn right along with him in the home. And that's not possible. People would tell you that's not possible. People would tell you there's no way someone could write books and do this kind of research and things like that. It's not possible if you do it on your own. Go try it and do it on your own, and you can just come back a few years from now and say, yep, I failed. But we
need God.
Yes. And honestly, I think I would be a completely different person if I hadn't been pushed into areas that I couldn't do on my own, because I would have been too, it's too easy just to rely on your own strength and just be like, oh, I got this, but being pushed in situations where you have to rely on him or you can't make it through. It's a beautiful experience. I wish every single person could experience what it feels like, because it's the most joyful thing in the entire world. It's the hardest thing, but it's also the most joyful. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I wouldn't trade it for a million vacations.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet you wanted to hit on?
I think I got a little bit off of your revisionist history.
No, I don't think we did. I think we answered it really well, actually.
Perfect. So yeah, I would just say, if there's anybody that's saying, okay, I'm facing this new history and I'm wondering about First Vision, Book of Mormon translation, seer stones, polygamy, like any of these things, you can go to the Joseph Smith Foundation website, and we're trying to get all of those resources there from a traditional perspective. And we have a lot of books and we have documentaries, and if we don't have them, we may have a project that you can volunteer with to help with, or go to your own. Yep. And I'll cheer you on.
Let me ask you this question. Got a couple to wrap up here. Where do you see this going? This new narrative that has come out. Do you think that there are enough people that recognize it for the falsehoods they are?
It's changing. I'm definitely hopeful. We definitely have a lot of work ahead. We're a little behind the game. It was interesting because shortly after Boyd K. Packer died, there was a scholar who was talking, and he was basically like, well, now we can kind of the last holdout is gone that had been involved, in these controversies. Right. And so I'm not going to lie that we have a lot of work to do, and it can feel like, wow, we're outnumbered. But there are people that want to hear. And as we talked about before, I believe Zion is meant to be built. And I believe that means, a progressive would say, yes, that means on a progressive foundation. I would say, no, that has to be on Joseph Smith's foundation, that it is true and that it is solid. I believe Joseph's boys are here. And a lot of them are sleeping, yes, just like Hubert C. Kimball said. But God will wake them up, and we will do this. We have to do this. We have to build a better future for our kids. If you don't want to do it for yourself or someone that's hurting, do it for your kids. But don't get discouraged. Even if one heart is turned. I mean, when we started, no one knew about this. No one had ever heard of Leonard Arrington, and no one was questioning rough stone rolling. That was 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago. Look at the difference today. That's just one family.
We've talked about this a little bit already, but we talked about, just one person, mm-hmm. right? Just doing something. You know who George Whitefield is?
Yes.
I'm sure you do.
I do.
We don't have Washington, and we don't have Franklin, and we don't have Jefferson if we don't have Whitefield first.
Right. Yes.
And maybe my job, maybe somebody else's job isn't to be whoever, but mm-hmm. maybe you're there to set that up.
Yes. And George Washington's mom did just as important of a job as George Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. If someone is hearing this and they want to reach out and help support the Joseph mm-hmm. Smith Foundation, how can they do that?
Okay, so they can go to the website and they can contact us through truejosephsmith@gmail.com, or they can, if they want to reach out to me directly, they can go to, they can email hannah.josephsmithfoundation@gmail.com. Or we have some other contact information on our website. We have a Facebook page. You can follow us on social media.
Is there anything in particular that you guys need more of right now? Is it just more bodies? I mean, what is it you guys could really use?
Absolutely, yes. I would say probably we definitely need people who are talented in graphics and web and video, meaning that they have those skills. And if you don't have those skills, one thing that I encourage parents to do is do that for your homeschool. Like if you're right. homeschooling, train your kids to have skills so they can go and do this. But even people that that are like, can't do any of those things, but you know what? I can reshare stuff on social media. I can leave reviews. That is one big thing that helps so much, is leaving reviews on Amazon. People don't realize actually how big of a role that plays in search engine optimization and marketing and Google and things like that. So just leaving reviews. We do have this project where we're trying to organize all of Joseph Smith's teachings by topic. We have most of Joseph Smith's done, but we're moving forward to do all of those who knew Joseph Smith. So those that were tutored by him, like Hubert C. Kimball, Brigham Young, and Eliza R. Snow, which I personally am very excited about. We're going to do some devotional books and fun things like that for women, and based off her teachings. So honestly, it's just kind of where people are at and what they feel like they want to do. If they feel led to reach out, please do. Awesome. We'll find a spot.
All right. Well, we've done 2 hours and 5 minutes. Hannah, you are so awesome. I mean that. Your whole family. The work you guys have done just can't be overstated, and are continuing to do. And I encourage anyone out there listening, if you have time on your hands and you want to devote to a worthy cause, I can't think of anything better than the Joseph Smith Foundation. So go check that out. Anything else you want to say in closing?
I would just say, I just want to say, for anyone that's doubting or ever has doubts, I want them to know that I have a testimony, that I know. There was a time in my life where I said, I believe Joseph Smith is a prophet. I think I know the Book of Mormon is true, but I know, and I know it, and it is true. And there is no more important work than spreading to this world, because it is the only answer we have, and it will change the world. It can help so many people. So it's worth every sacrifice to do.
Awesome. All right, everybody, we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.